of the more delightful opportunities, we believe, in the experience of the EPIIC experience is the opportunity to be in several hour informal conversations and seminars, as they were, conversations, which are available to you in the context of the 4:30 to 6:30 time frame today. If you look in the schedule of your program, you'll see that we have these expert-led discussions. Political Islam, the state of the state, media, rule of law and human rights, Iran and proliferation, trauma and resilience. I think that's in Justine here. Yes. Justine, you were mentioned in the opening remarks yesterday in a beautiful way as putting our students into comfortable zones of discomfort. So if anyone wants to find themselves in a very comfortable, uncomfortable situation, Justine's the lady. Entrepreneurship, terrorism, refugees, women, Israel-Palestine, Gulf politics in Lebanon. There is one change here, and that is, strangely, we are, Gideon and Dick Simon, Gideon Argov and Dick Simon are actually going to be joining Rob Blecker and Mumina Rabbani, looking more broadly at Israel-Palestine and internal Israeli-Palestinian politics and the great divide of Israel-Palestine. So, otherwise these forums are as advertised. And there's one on Lebanon, which is going to be co-led by one of our wonderful undergraduate synaptics and then EPIIC student and now teaching TA, Alex Keller. I'm partial to all of them. I don't know what I'm going to do. Hopefully you will figure out a way to commit yourself to one session. That's what we're asking for. We're not asking you to just dip in and out, but to commit yourself to one session and to sign up, and we'll direct you to where these rooms will be. I myself will be in a room with folks thinking about next year. So my workshop is on the future of Russia, and we're hiding out. You can't join us. Except next year, you can all come back. So that's it. Duncan Pickard is coming late. One of our fantastic alumni is coming in from Berlin, and we'll join the panel at the very end. But right now, it belongs to Elissa.
Good afternoon. Hello and welcome to our panel on international institutions and interventions. My name is Elissa Miller and I'm a senior here at Tufts, and I'm a member of the EPIIC Colloquium this year. I had the privilege to travel to Amman, Jordan this winter with EPIIC to conduct research on identity issues in Jordan through the lens of Jordanian-Palestinian relations, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel today. The issue of interventions and the role of international institutions in the Middle East and North Africa is clearly a controversial topic, given the myriad of ongoing conflicts in the region and the international community's mixed record of successes and failures when responding to these conflicts. Tellingly, when Anthony Shadid, to whom this symposium is dedicated, was writing about the Arab Spring in the New York Times, he described the intervention in Libya in 2011 as, quote, the kind of intervention that has long been toxic to the Arab world, unquote. Today, Syria remains paralyzed by civil war, Libya is consumed by chaos, Tunisia struggles with constitution building, and Egypt faces growing violence and a resurgent military in the wake of the controversial overthrow of a democratically elected president. In addressing these developments, we are confronted with several questions. Has intervention in Syria ceased to be a credible option? What will the role of the doctrine of responsibility to protect be in the region going forward? What should the role of the United Nations and other international institutions be in strengthening the rule of law in transitioning countries in the region? And finally, what should the balance be between diplomacy and the use of force? These are just some of the pressing questions that we hope our panel of esteemed experts can shed light on. The politics of intervention in the Middle East and North Africa will certainly remain a fraught issue, while the debate surrounding the role of international institutions in the region is not likely to be resolved in the near future. In the interest of dialogue and a spirited exchange between our panelists and the audience, we have asked, and our speakers have agreed, to limit their remarks to 10 minutes each. I will introduce each panelist before he speaks. After all the panelists have finished speaking, the the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions, and the panelists will have a chance to respond to one another if they wish. Our first panelist is Dr. Saad Eddin Ibrahim. He is the founder of the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies in Cairo, Egypt. Dr. Ibrahim is credited with playing a leading role in the revival of Egypt's contemporary research-based civil society movement, and he ranks among the most prominent sociologists in the Arab world. For much of his professional career, he was a professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo. He was published widely on Islam, politics, democracy, citizenship, and civil society, and he is the recipient of numerous awards, including the American Sociological Association Distinguished Scholar Award and the Sakharov Prize of the European Parliament. In 2000 and 2003, he was convicted and held in prison on political charges, but was eventually acquitted by Egypt's highest court of appeals. Dr. Ibrahim has held a number of visiting professorships with renowned universities in the United States, and in 2006 he was awarded the Ian Raythew Democracy Award at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he had previously been a public policy scholar. He is also a board member of the Arab Democracy Foundation. Dr. Ibrahim, you may begin when you wish.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a most kind introduction. And sometimes when I hear this loading introduction, I wish my wife was here. She never recognizes how great I am. But anyway, I am delighted. But I heard that husbands always complain about the same thing. At any rate, I am delighted to be in this great institution, and I owe this institution a great debt because two of my most able assistants, one former and one current assistant, are graduates of this institution. I'm referring to Sharif Mansour, I don't know if he's around or not, and to Dalia Ziada. Dalia is currently the executive director in my center, so she's my boss. And she's doing a very good job, and I attribute that to the solid training she received in this place. The world was surprised and stunned, and sometimes delighted and perplexed by the so-called the Arab Spring. And even though the title for this panel is Foreign Intervention, I had to make this observation first because we'll build on it later on in the discussion. But I want to remind you of what also a neighboring scholar here at Harvard had once written off our part of the world as hopeless, as being immune to democratization. And it was called the Arab exceptionalism. First, it was the Muslims who can never really respond positively to a democratic way of life. And then came a revolution in Indonesia, so the scholar modified his theory as well. Indonesia is more of an East Asian country than a Muslim country, but the bulk of the Muslim world is immune to democracy and to civil society practices. Then occurred the revolution in Tunisia, and quickly after that in Egypt, and then in Libya, and then in Yemen. So that was really the end of the so-called Muslim exceptionalism and Arab exceptionalism. And now, because Libya witnessed a foreign intervention, that would be an entry into the topic of the panel about foreign intervention. And I have 2 or 3 remarks I want to say here. That foreign intervention in Middle Eastern and Arab affairs is as old as the French expedition, the Napoleonic expedition back in 1800, exactly 1798. And since then, we have had something like, by my count at least, 112 foreign intervention in our region. And in the last 50 years or 60 years after the Second World War, we had something like 60 intervention. 60 intervention. And believe it or not, 15 of those have been by the United States. No decade has gone by without an American military intervention in our part of the world. And I want to emphasize that because I saw some military cadets at lunch. I don't know if they're in the audience or not, but I want to tell them to be prepared probably for more intervention. Not that I'm calling for it, but it does happen whether we ask for it or not. And the reason for it is that, as President Eisenhower once described the Middle East, he said it is the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. So I don't know if that is the effect of his Republican background, real estate and business, but he described the Middle East as the most valuable piece of real estate. One reason for that is oil, but the other reason is the strategic location of the Middle East. Having the Suez Canal, the Strait of Bab el-Mandab, and the Red Sea, the Arab-Persian Gulf, also the Gibraltar Strait between Spain and Morocco. All of that seem to have put the Middle East for the last 2 centuries always in the center of global politics, inviting whoever is the superpower or a big power at the time to intervene. In the 19th century, it was basically Great Britain, followed by France. But in the 20th century, we begin to see the European disposition to intervention receding, and an American advances into the region begin to grow year after year until we get to the current point. The reason for the intervention, as I said, basically interest, oil, and increasingly, while during the Cold War, of course, with Russia or the Soviet Union, the Middle East was truly, truly crucial, and hence it was understandable that each one of the superpowers at the time would try to create client states or client regimes in the region. And that gave rise to frequent intervention. But with the end of the Cold War, we begin to see that the reason for intervention is more of internal domestic instability that comes usually with collective social unrest in many of these countries. And the social unrest was because of the protracted tyrannical rule in our part of the world. You had regimes that will live on and continue to rule despotically for as long as 60 years. And some, in a single country like Libya, for example, one ruler, Al-Qaddafi, ruled for 42 years. In a country like Egypt, Mubarak ruled for 30 years. He was the third longest ruler in our history. 6,000 years of Egyptian history, we had only 3 who ruled that long. One was Ramses II, 4,000 years earlier, and he ruled for 42 years. And the second one was Muhammad Ali at the beginning of the 19th century. He ruled also for roughly 41 years. And then Hosni Mubarak. Assad, and the Assad family in Syria ruled for over 60 years. I mean, between the father and the son. So having these protracted dictators in a part of the world that was growing increasingly younger population, and here demographics were very, very significant, because as we counted it in the Ibn Khaldun Center, our research center, is the average difference between the average citizen in many of these countries and the rulers was something like 50 years. So the young revolutionaries, and they wrote something to that effect in the Washington Post, the young revolutionary in Tahrir Square averaged age between 16 and 25 years of age. Whereas Hosni Mubarak, the ruler at the time, was already over 80 years old. So you have, he was actually 85 years old when the revolution took place. So you had here about 50 years gap. According to Ibn Khaldun, one of the prominent Arab thinkers of the 14th century, he counts a generation as 25 years. So by Ibn Khaldun counter, after whom I named my center, we had 2 generations here. If you can imagine, 50-year difference between the average revolutionary and the ruler in a country like Egypt, or in Libya, or in Syria, or in, as we see in Syria, you could see why the region was to explode sooner or later. Now that it has exploded in several places, I heard a question this morning in an earlier panel of why some countries have so far evaded the Arab Spring. And that is mostly the monarchical ruled countries. And I think, in all fairness, kings and the emirs seem to have handled governance far better than the Republican counterpart. Partly because they are more educated, partly because they are more sensitive to the demands of their younger generation, and they were able, in fact, to deal with it more creatively than the Republican colleagues. So here is my first take at the theme, and I think, just in concluding, that foreign powers have a role to play. Not that we like it, but the question is whether they do it or not. My quest is that they do it in an enlightened manner, is to understand that the revolution could not and should not be suppressed either by internal forces or by external forces, but to be dealt with creatively, to respond to the needs, the demands of the younger generation, and to respond to it in an orderly fashion. If we do that, I think the part of the world that I come from could contribute to global peace and to regional prosperity. And with that, I'd like to end my remarks. Thank you very much for listening.
Our second speaker today is Dr. Hugh Roberts. Dr. Hugh Roberts is the Edward Keller Professor of North African and Middle East History at Tufts University. From 1997 to 2002, he was a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. He is also the former director of the North Africa Project at the International Crisis Group, a post he held from 2002 to 2007. He was called back to the International Crisis Group during the first half of 2011 for the start of the Arab Spring. Dr. Roberts has been doing research on Algeria since the 1970s and is an expert on Algerian politics, and the history of Islamism in North Africa, in addition to Egyptian political history. His books include Algerian Socialism and the Kabylia Question, The Battlefield, Algeria from 1988 to 2002, and Berber Government, the Kabylia Polity in Pre-Colonial Algeria. Dr. Roberts, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. In addressing this audience, I am mindful that a significant element of it is constituted by the EPIIC Colloquium students. And the thought occurs to me that probably, well, certainly most of them, and probably, possibly all of them, have been born since 1990. And therefore have been habituated to the serial wars of intervention and the frequent imposition of sanctions and freezing of assets, that is, the conduct of economic warfare against those countries that have found themselves falling foul of, or falling foul of the so-called international community. A major event occurred last year, or two closely linked important events, when a movement of public opinion, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, was manifested against the proposal for yet another military intervention, this time in the Syrian drama. I wish to suggest that American and British public opinion have been right. And I wish, in the 9.5 minutes left to me, to provide certain elements to reinforce that reluctance on the part of the populations of our countries to support or acquiesce in any more such wars of intervention, by explaining at least part of what I think has been wrong with these wars. How do we evaluate these interventions? Has the intervention in Afghanistan been a success? Have the two United Nations wars against Iraq been a success? 3 years on, when we contemplate the actual state of affairs in Libya, do we regard NATO's intervention there as a success? Has success, in other words, justified these deeds? And if you give yourself the answer, well, actually, no, there isn't any success around to justify these deeds, what else might justify? Let me at least raise those questions for you to meditate. These interventions have had several features in common. They've all involved violations of the sovereignty of the states concerned. Violations rationalized in the name of a higher principle than that of state sovereignty. These violations have been rationalized by the invocation, in particular, of new principles, the so-called right, or in some versions, the so-called duty, of humanitarian intervention, le droit, or le devoir d'ingérence humanitaire, as one of the principal authors of this idea, Bernard Kouchner, has called it. A more recent variant of this, or a supplement to it, is the so-called responsibility to protect, R2P. These are innovations. They have been adopted pretty quickly and pretty uncritically by the powers of the earth as sources of justification for what they almost certainly wanted to do in any case. Another feature of these interventions has been the relentless and invariable demonization of the head of state in the countries targeted. Although Saddam Hussein, of course, I'm not for a moment suggesting that I personally liked Saddam Hussein, that's not the issue. Although he had close and cordial and working relations with Washington, he was abruptly demonized. The same was true of Gaddafi, who was the recognized head of state, recognized by all the Western states and having diplomatic relations with them all, and then from virtually one day to the next, he is demonized. And the point about the demonization is that it rules out the possibility of a non-violent resolution of the conflict. That's the fundamental point about it. My point is not that these people were above criticism. Personally, I would have been heartily delighted to see the Iraqi people themselves get rid of Saddam Hussein, and I would have been heartily delighted to see the Libyan people, by their own efforts, get rid of Gaddafi. Neither of those things were allowed to happen because they were preempted by interventions. The point I'm making is that the demonization ruled out non-military resolutions. In other words, it completely abolished the possibility of a political approach. And that's an important fact about these interventions. Another important fact is the manufacturing of pretexts. There's no doubt that the Iraqi government in 1990 made a major mistake that it could be roundly faulted for. Invading Kuwait was clearly wrong, and it was clearly right to pressure Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. Did that mean destroying the infrastructure of urban life in the whole of Iraq and killing scores of thousands of Iraqis? One of the reasons why there was Western enthusiasm for that war was a story that went around the world that Iraqi troops in Kuwait had been massacring Kuwaiti babies by turning off their incubators, a story that was massively endorsed and was a complete lie. And this is a feature of the interventions, the mobilizing of public opinion to the point of hysteria by lies, the quality of which I think the late Mr. Goebbels would have been quite proud. In 2011, the comparable feature of that drama was the story that an act of genocide was in prospect. Now, that's an important implication of the doctrine of R2P. The doctrine of R2P had an entirely honorable origin in the horrific events in the Great Lakes region of Africa, the genocide in Rwanda, which was indeed a genocide, and the ethnic cleansing, at least, whether one wants to call it genocide, that occurred in the Balkans. There was absolutely no prospect whatsoever of genocide in Libya. The conflict was not ethnic in character, and there was not any evidence whatever to justify the expectation that there would be even a major massacre in Benghazi. None whatever. In all the other towns that have been retaken by the government forces, no massacres have occurred. None. And I wish to put it to you that one of the features, therefore, in this particular case, is the appalling trivialization of the idea of genocide. Genocide is a serious matter, but given R2P as a trigger for intervention, it means that people have an interest in pretending that genocide is occurring or about to occur, and that involves trivializing in a way I find outrageous, something that many of us here present should consider should never be trivialized, but that is what has happened. I think I have 3 minutes left. A feature of this also is that the hysteria that has accompanied these interventions has actually paralyzed public opinion in our own countries. The hysteria has had a panicking effect. It has ruled out debate. It has meant that the function of a proper democracy is unable to actually take place. It means that there is basically no alternative gets a hearing to the extreme use of force. I think that a major aspect, therefore, of these interventions has been the damage done to the quality of public and political life in our own countries. Given that one of the features of globalization is the breaking down of the division between internal political life and foreign affairs, external affairs. Now, let's just quickly look at one of the key principles invoked. I only have time to deal with one of them, and that is the idea of international law. That was certainly invoked in the case of Iraq in 1990. It wasn't invoked in 2003. What was invoked was an entirely spurious idea, on the one hand, for American consumption that Baghdad had been behind 9/11, and for British consumption that Baghdad, according to a dodgy dossier, was a major nuclear threat to Europe and to Britain. These were completely untrue, and it's now known to be untrue. There's a problem here in that these interventions have been authorized by the United Nations Security Council that is dominated by 5 countries that are in effect the victors of a war that ended 69 years ago. And that when they decide to go to war with a member of the United Nations, they rename themselves the international community. And that's a fundamental point. India has 1.2 billion human beings, and it also has nuclear weapons. But it's not among the elect 5 who call themselves the international community. Neither is Brazil, neither is Germany, neither is Indonesia. Many of those countries actually vocally opposed the intervention in Libya, but they didn't count as part of the international community. My point, of course, is that it's time for a reform of the UN. That the idea that the United Nations Security Council, dominated by the 5 veto-holding permanent powers, represents the international community is wide open to question. The idea that it is capable of seriously and sincerely invoking democratic principles is, it seems to me, absurd. And finally, let me make this point about law. I was brought up to believe that one of the principles of a system of law is that no one is above the law. Nul n'est au-dessus de la loi, as the French would say. And that you cannot be judge and jury in your own case. But the operation of the Security Council means that 5 states, all armed with nuclear weapons are permanently above the law, which is why it's a waste of time to talk about the legality of the intervention in Iraq. That's completely beside the point. It's bound to be legal in the sense that it's not illegal, because no legal action can be taken against the 5 veto-holding powers. And the other point here is, of course, that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. The other point is that the principles of law, when invoked in this way, are actually being debased. And we've seen this most recently in terms of the contamination effect this has on our own states. It used to be a constitutional principle in the United States that wars could not be engaged in without the consent of Congress. What's happened to that principle? Maybe it's about to be reasserted. Maybe the shift of opinion that occurred last year will bear long-term fruit. I personally hope so. But certainly in the most recent case of Egypt, where there hasn't been an intervention, we've seen a very remarkable state of affairs where the United States government publicly decides that it's not going to honor an American law that obliges it to break off aid to a country where a democratically elected government has just been overthrown. And that, I think, is an instance of what this syndrome that has developed over the last 24 years has actually been doing to the quality of our own politics, our own republics or constitutional monarchies. We've seen an erosion of the idea of law, and in part that's because this idea has been debased, as other highly elevated principles have been debased by the way these interventions have been conducted. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Mr. Richard Atwood. Mr. Atwood is currently the Director of Research in the Brussels headquarters of the International Crisis Group. At the Crisis Group, he heads the thematic research team. He will be moving to New York as the Crisis Group's representative to the UN shortly. Before joining the Crisis Group, Mr. Atwood worked for about 15 years in the UN, as well as with other organizations across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America. Mr. Atwood, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elissa. And thank you very much to the organisers, showing it to be a terrific event. It's a great pleasure to be here. I feel like a bit of an intruder because I'm not really an expert on MENA, certainly not compared with my fellow panelists. So what I thought I'd do was, instead of talk about what's happened or what's happening in any sort of particular country, I'd make a few broader points about interventions, mostly interventions related to wars or violent crises. So I want to talk about first R2P, the responsibility to protect, which Professor Roberts talked about. I'd like to talk about the International Criminal Court, and I'd like to talk too about the use or utility of force. Now these are huge and complex topics. I'm not going to do them justice in 10 minutes, but I hope at least I can throw out a few questions which people can pick up if they want to in the discussion afterwards. I'll focus on MENA, and I think in the end all roads will lead to Syria, as they're doing in this in the other sessions. Though I'll try and bring in some places outside MENA too. So first, the responsibility to protect, the doctrine of R2P, which Professor Roberts talked about. Where is the doctrine after Libya and after Syria? I think probably Hugh is expecting me to rush to the defense of R2P, and I think he's going to be disappointed, because I have to admit I find it very difficult at the moment to defend R2P. I think supporters of R2P would argue that Libya marked a high point for the doctrine. As Gaddafi's forces advanced on Benghazi, the Security Council mandated force to protect civilians. But I think even supporters of R2P would now argue that NATO's actions in Libya, overstepping its civilian protection mandate to overthrow Gaddafi, so using a civilian protection mandate to pursue regime change, then undermine both the doctrine of R2P and undermines council coherence in Syria. I think Russia in particular, Professor Katz I'm sure will talk about it, but also China, other important states from the global south that were on the Security Council at the time, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. I think they argue that they were misled, that NATO went too far, and they referred explicitly to this when they blocked initial resolutions on Syria, citing fears that these initial resolutions would be used again to justify military action. I don't think you can overstate the impact of Libya on Syria. It's a very different geopolitical context. Relations between Russia and Syria are very different. Relations between Syria and the region are very different. But clearly acrimony in the Council over Libya has made it more difficult to forge consensus over Syria. Now, does this signal the end of R2P? I think clearly it's exposed its weaknesses. If the doctrine was meant in the face of impending atrocities to cut through the politics like a knife through butter, clearly that hasn't happened. In fact, just the opposite. R2P has been instrumentalized. It's been politicized, as Hugh said. It's been politicized by Security Council members. Now, and in fact, what happened in Libya, I think, was very similar to what happened in Côte d'Ivoire, just the same year or the year before. I think its supporters would argue that despite these difficulties, R2P is sort of down but not out, that the ideas underlying R2P still form the basis for interventions, not necessarily in the Middle East, but perhaps now in the Central African Republic, where there's no clear interests, in South Sudan and in other places. And perhaps that's partly true, but the term itself, the term of R2P itself, the use of the term has become, I don't know, maybe toxic is too strong a word, but certainly very tainted. The R2P term has been tarnished, and even people that make those arguments in those terms no longer use the expression of R2P to frame arguments of humanitarian interventions, like shooting yourself in the foot. It's counterproductive. So, and again, we can talk more about R2P afterwards. I think there's certainly more to say. So that's R2P. What about the International Criminal Court? Now, again, I don't want to get into the whole peace justice debate. I want to look at a small part of it, which is to ask whether the International Criminal Court taking up a case during a conflict will help end it or to deter particularly brutal tactics during a war. This is one of the main rationales for the criminal court. It's one of the main rationales for the support for the court by the human rights movement. And again, it's floated in Syria. Many people call for the Security Council to refer the situation there to the ICC. Now, of course, powerful states, the P3 in particular, often use ICC referrals like sanctions in the way that Hugh was referring to, not because they genuinely believe that they will change people's behavior, but to signal displeasure or to create momentum for further action. Plus, of course, Syria is probably not going to get referred to the Security Council, to the ICC. Russia's probably not going to let that happen. And I think let's forget for the moment the double standards that Hugh talked about, particularly with the ICC, that 3 of the permanent members he spoke about are not actually parties to their own statute themselves. But let's leave all these issues aside and imagine that the Council did refer Syria to the criminal court. I think it's a legitimate question to ask, would that really, almost 3 years into a brutal conflict, change its protagonists' tactics? I think there's little evidence from elsewhere, whether Libya, whether Côte d'Ivoire, whether Sudan, whether the Congo, that it actually would. In fact, in Libya, the referral to the ICC probably raised the stakes of the conflict. It prevented anyone finding a quick exit for Gaddafi and arguably prolonged the conflict. Plus, like R2P, the court was instrumentalized, it was politicized. So rather than cutting through the politics, it became part of the politics. Now, this doesn't mean that crimes in Syria don't merit prosecution. It doesn't mean that no one should be held accountable. They should, of course. The question is when. And my guess is that the ICC taking up the Syria situation now, even were that possible, would make little difference to the way the war is being fought. Would make little difference to conflict dynamics on the ground. So R2P, the ICC, let me say a quick word about the use of force during and after war. And I think it's difficult not to relate this to Syria, where again the military action has been on and off the table. I think that the Russians agreed to last week's Security Council resolution, which is actually a surprisingly strongly worded resolution, has been partly to avoid renewed calls for military action in Washington or in Paris. I think the starting point to think of military action is, what purpose is it going to serve? What is it being used for? And some of the ideas floated in Syria are either to punish the use of chemical weapons, to ease human suffering, to topple Assad, or to force him to negotiate. Now, certainly in Syria, committing ground troops seems out of the question, and probably for good reason. But a bombing campaign alone is very, very unlikely to topple Assad. There's no reason to think that just a bombardment will topple the regime. Nor are bombs likely to improve humanitarian access or relieve suffering, particularly given it's a civil war. It's not a case of one-sided violence. A bombing campaign might conceivably, you could imagine it potentially deterring the further use of chemical weapons, but probably not if the regime's survival was at stake. So maybe in some cases, maybe not. Would bombing force Assad to negotiate? Would it shift the dynamics of the conflict in a way that makes him pursue a process in Geneva more likely? This is what Michael Ignatieff has argued in the New York Times a few days ago. I think it's very difficult to say. It would clearly be a hugely risky strategy. It would introduce a powerful new element of uncertainty with very unpredictable consequences in Syria itself and beyond. Could easily worsen the humanitarian situation. Clearly wouldn't enjoy Security Council backing. So even in the limited sense of legality that Hugh refers to, it wouldn't even have that. Might it shift dynamics in a way that provides an opening? Again, it's difficult to say. It's a roll of the dice. I think it's very difficult to know how exactly it would affect the situation. But I think it's also probably worth saying that at the moment nothing else is working either. So for those who argue against military action, they also have to propose something different to what's happening in Geneva. Again, this is not supporting military action at all, just if that wasn't clear already. Let me say something very quickly about the use of force after a war. And again, it's going to be difficult not to relate this to Syria. I think it's widely recognized that if there is a mediated end to the conflict, and again, I completely agree with others that have said that that looks very remote at the moment, that looks like it belongs to the world of fantasy at the moment, but if there is a mediated end to the conflict, it'll need international enforcement, it'll need a peacekeeping mission. Now, Professor Norton spoke very movingly yesterday about the terrible destruction of Syrian society, of the state infrastructure, but I think the security environment, however inclusive a political settlement is likely to be just as difficult. It's not going to be an environment for a classic UN peacekeeping mission, staffed by South Asians, staffed by Africans. It's just not that type of environment. Now, Western troops will come with their own baggage. There's likely to be a lot of resistance in the region. But I think feasibly, if there is ever an end to the violence, when it comes, we can expect again the deployment of Western troops. And there's advantages to disadvantages and disadvantages to that, but I think that's probably going to happen. So let me just conclude in the minute or so remaining. I realise this has all sound very gloomy. This has all sounded quite gloomy. I suspect the other panels were just as gloomy, but certainly this panel is likely to be very gloomy. And I should qualify that. I think the end of the Cold War, the Security Council's ability since then to arrive at some sort of consensus about most conflicts has spawned a wide array of norms, of activities that we now associate with conflict prevention and peace building, and including some of the ones that I've spoken about. I think overall, and not necessarily in the Middle East and North Africa, but overall globally, this sort of massive proliferation of, let's say, peace-building activities, I think it has had a positive impact. I think the net impact has been positive, particularly in Africa, if not in the Middle East. I think it's also a mistake to draw too many conclusions from a particularly geopolitically thorny conflict like Syria. I think it would be a mistake to conclude too much from that. But whatever Syria's complexity, I think it exposes challenges that occur elsewhere as well, and exposes some trends that we're only going to see grow. First and foremost, of course, there are the divisions, which I'm sure others will talk about, mostly related to ideas of sovereignty and non-intervention between Russia and China on the one hand and the West on the other, that mirror those of the Cold War, with the Global South, or sort of the rehatted non-aligned movement as the Global South, usually siding with non-intervention unless they have strong national interests in a given conflict that pull them in the other direction. But they usually side with non-intervention. So certainly from the 90s, the trend towards intervention has shifted right back. I think the dominant force in world politics now is likely to remain sovereignty, whatever the debates in Washington, whatever the debates in Brussels or London. I think secondly, Syria comes at a time when military solutions to conflicts are becoming ever more popular. And Hugh spoke about this a little bit or referred to it, but you have Libya, of course, Cote d'Ivoire, Georgia, Sri Lanka, even perhaps now South Sudan. Now some of these are hatted or dressed up as civilian protection, but we shouldn't lose sight they're military ends to conflict. They're not political ends to wars. I think particularly, but not only in the US, realism is returning in force, partly because the strategic implications of the war on terror are becoming clearer, but also partly because the limits of state building are becoming clearer too. And last, some of the norms that have spread over the past decade are under fiercer attack than ever before. I think if you look at the African pushback against the International Criminal Court, this is not just self-interested resistance by people who have something to lose, it's intellectual attack too, as the contradictions in these doctrines become clearer and the empirical evidence mounts against them. So I posed 3 questions. How tarnished is R2P? Does the ICC really deter? And what purpose would force serve in Syria? But I think the overarching question is, so where is the conflict prevention agenda? Where's it going? We're just going through a rough patch? We'll muddle along okay in places, bad in others? Or is this short era of peacemaking over the last 20 years, over the last 2.5 decades, is it coming slowly to a close? Battered, if you like, first by the war on terror, then by global power shifts, and now by deteriorating relations between the great powers and war weariness and austerity in the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Atwood. Our next panelist is Mr. Michael Niconchuk. Mike is the Emergency Response Coordinator at Questscope in Jordan. Mike is a graduate of Tufts University, where he was involved in many Institute for Global Leadership programs, focusing primarily on post-conflict entrepreneurship and reconciliation. In 2011, Mike began working at the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, examining entrepreneurship and impact investing in the MENA region. In 2012, he began his work at Questscope in Amman. As the Emergency Response Coordinator, Mike maintains a lead project design and coordination role for Questscope's work in response to the Syrian crisis, representing Questscope in the UN-led sector working group system of the humanitarian response and serving in a technical capacity for Questscope's Children in Conflict with the Law and Violence Reduction Programming. Mike serves as a leading member of the Education Sector Working Group, Education Strategic Advisory Group, Child Protection Sector Working Group, and Youth Task Force in Amman and in Zatari Refugee Camp, in addition to working closely with UNICEF and UNHCR's Protection, Legal, and Youth departments for designing new programming for refugee youth in conflict with the law and expanding referral systems for at-risk youth refugees. In Zatari Refugee Camp, Mike has been an outspoken advocate for improving community mobilization and community engagement, working with the UN and other international NGOs to design youth civic participation programs, revise community messaging and outreach systems, and better integrate the refugee community into program design processes.
My slides are all just pictures, I promise. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Sherman and Heather and the IGL team and all the EPIIC students. The EPIIC students have been a huge inspiration to me and everyone at Questscope. We had the privilege of hosting them in the winter when they were in Jordan, including Elissa. We had a great time, and I hope that they got something out of it as well. I'm sort of, as all of the words that Elissa used to describe me, all that it means is that I play a lot with the UN, and I play a lot in the refugee camp. The Zatari refugee camp on the border between Jordan and Syria. I just called the talk that I'm giving today Nizam, the system, is what that means in Arabic. Intervention with good intentions among Syria's displaced. I saw some guys in their early 20s who were walking around the camp the other day, and I asked one of them, I said, Mohammed, if I had to talk about the idea of international institutions, what should I say? And he said to me, just tell them that he who plants any seed will one day reap it. And what he meant by that is that the experience of displacement is a real, a complicated, and integral part of war. And that what we see in 30 years in Syria will have serious roots in the individual experience of refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, Iraq, and wherever they may find themselves. When I first heard the deep thud of bombs in Daraa in South Syria, you could hear the sound across the border into the camp, and you could feel the ground shake just a little bit. I overheard one guy saying, "Hayhu wa sawt isqat nizam," that that's the sound of the fall of the regime. And the guy next to him was joking, he said, which one? They were referring to either he means in Syria or the way that the refugee camp functions.
I fast forward to this picture that many of you saw on Twitter or on CNN or elsewhere of the 4-year-old named Marwan, who many news outlets said was crossing the desert by himself because he was separated from his family. Now, the original tweet that came with this photo from Andrew Harper, the director of UNHCR in Jordan, was that he had been temporarily separated. In reality, his family was about 20 feet in front of him, but it's really easy to use one of those telephoto lenses that Sabrina is using and zoom in on this image and say that there was a 4-year-old walking across the desert by himself. Why am I talking about this? Because it's a perfect example of how, in general, the West has lost a grip on reality in the conflict in Syria. The media is a serious part of intervention as it shapes cultural opinion and public will towards any conflict. It ties into what my boss has always called the golden rule, that he who has the gold makes the rule. If those who have the gold are exposed to images like this of a 4-year-old walking across the desert by himself, if they're clinging on to the image of a hero that is not actually real, the gold and the way that the humanitarian intervention follows will follow that pattern and that mindset. Now, the mandate of the entire UN system is nothing that any of us envy. It's huge. I respect so much that they have done. So much in response to the Syrian crisis has been done correctly, and so much has been done incorrectly. But overall, it's been done very expensively. That the Regional Response Plan Draft 6 was the most expensive humanitarian plea in human history, and several billion dollars. Now, that at any rate, it has cost so much, literally and figuratively, to respond to this crisis. As the crisis and the response to it is considered an emergency, people often separate the word innovation. That if you were a doctor, an emergency response, you don't need to know what your patient is feeling. I don't need to ask you, hey, how did that feel? Because my job is to stop your bleeding. That can't go on for 2 years. Emergency medicine would never be allowed to go on for more than a couple of hours until the patient regains consciousness or regains the ability to speak to you. The emergency response system in the humanitarian world should be no exception to that same principle. There's 3 points that I'd like to talk about, as briefly as I can, as very briefly as I can. And the first is that the UN system by nature is incredibly bureaucratic. The entire international NGO humanitarian response system is by nature very bureaucratic, but it has very good intentions. It's not unlike a very old, very clunky dinosaur with a flower in his hand. The governments of the MENA region, the governments of the Middle East, are not unlike this picture here on the left, of someone who's not really sure what's going on, but standing behind massive, massive piles of bureaucracy. So the spread of the crisis the speed of the crisis and the speed of the human need far outpaces the speed of the response. That by combining 2 really anachronistic and expensive systems, the humanitarian system and MENA governments, both with independent mandates, both with a perceived monopoly on best practice, and both engaged in resource competition, makes the climate in that region incredibly competitive and incredibly toxic, full of mutual suspicion for each other, hiding behind someone who has good intentions but could hurt you. Neither the humanitarian system nor governments in the MENA region have effective user and feedback mechanisms. That's counter-cultural in some way to the cultures of both of those systems. The second point that I'd like to make, if I have it here, here's just a picture of Zate, an aerial view of the camp when it was at about 140,000 people, is that the humanitarian aid system, this is really low, I just took that off, I'm sorry. But the humanitarian aid system is designed to perpetuate the hegemony of the humanitarian aid system. Now, the major caveat here is the insurance of security and safety for refugees. Of course, it's a paramount need. But what do we mean when we say the safety of a refugee? That safety and protection are, of course, important, but within that framework, we still have the responsibility to innovate, especially if security means more than just protection from harm. Safety in its most serious sense means the provision of a situation in which any man, woman, or child has the capacity to develop his or her resilience, to make it through this conflict alive. Because the system cannot keep operating in a way in which it tries to make everything stable in a situation that has been inherently unstable for more than 2 years. Ironically, the very top-down nature of the emergency response system has replicated much of the environment that people fled from in Syria. That there's a lack of transparent decision-making, and there's very nominal civil society participation in which the way that a refugee camp functions is that the roles provided for individuals are perhaps unintentionally, meant to pacify them, meant to say, you stay in your place, you can be part of a committee, but I won't actually listen to what you're going to say. Now, that system has really stifled the voice, or I would call it the agency from an anthropological perspective, of many Syrian refugees. And it's created an environment in which the response to something that the community of NGOs doesn't understand, whether it's the black market, the informal economy among the refugee community, if we don't understand it, we'll regulate it. That's the response pattern. That I don't understand you, your presence is somewhat disturbing to me doing my job, so I will regulate you. Now, sorry, what's the solution to that? I mean, the thing that I can think of is to move towards a greater reliance on the refugee community themselves in exile, with the infrastructural response taking into account the psychosocial and emotional well-being of refugees. That we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have police officers, we have teachers. We have 700,000 people from Syria now living in Jordan. Yet the reliance on those people and on their skill set doesn't exist because they're labeled as perhaps victims, is one way to put it. The perpetuating a culture of victimhood just because you're a refugee actually really decreases the role that you could ever play in your own healing process and in the healing process of those around you. Now, the third point that I'd like to make is about international institutions operating in a post-9/11 world and what that means. That, as many other panelists have talked about, the UN system is very much Western. It's a post-World War II creation in which the voices from the East are very limited, if not deliberately stifled. That the system is also operating in a very new context in the Arab world. It's been years since there has been a refugee camp that looks like that in the Arab world. You're dealing with a highly educated refugee population that came from houses that were made of concrete, two-story houses with nice bathrooms, with beautiful windows overlooking a garden. That the fall, even if people say, oh, Zaatari is a 5-star refugee camp in comparison to other ones that we've seen, the fall that people have taken is much greater than we've seen in many other conflicts around the world. Now, I myself am not innocent of this, but when we approach, why are these the two pictures that I chose to have on the slide? Because these are two of the only heroes that the West has clung to in the past year and a half of violent conflicts in the Muslim world. That we have Malala on the right and Marwan, this 4-year-old lost in the desert, on the left. These are two of the only heroes that the West has been able to find for conflicts relating to Muslims. And what that says is that we have a tough time finding heroes in the Muslim world in a post-9/11 context. And the way that the system approaches these conflicts is pretty damaging to their resolution, to resolving these conflicts. So, in conclusion, I'd like to just summarize in 4 points that the machinery that we currently have in the humanitarian system is too slow and too large given the speed and the complexity of the problem. We need to think how to make the system faster, how to make it cheaper and more efficient, because if war ends up being cheaper than humanitarian aid, the case for nonviolent intervention is really difficult. The second point, we need to increase the potential for client feedback mechanisms. No private company would be allowed to operate in the same system in which they're never taking into account the voices or the opinions of the client. There's no incentive so far for them to have any positive client feedback mechanisms, partially because the accountability structure is always upward to those who have the money, to those who provide funds for humanitarian aid. So we need to have a cultural shift within the sector, within the industry, to actually have 2 sets of accountability, one upwards to our donors and one, and more importantly, down to the beneficiary. The third point is that there has so far been an insufficient effort put into mapping and utilizing the resources of refugee communities from Syria and around the world, that we create dependence and we over-assume victimization in many situations. The last point is that the system needs to have a cultural or paradigmatic shift in which it allows itself to relinquish control. Because to truly empower another individual is incredibly risky. The more power that I give to Elissa, the more that she can use that against me. The motto of the organization that I work for is to put the last first. And the caveat to that is that you have to put the first last in that context. And that's a very difficult lesson for the sector as a whole to learn, but one that we need to learn if we are to respond to humanitarian crises in a cheaper way and in a more effective way, thinking of the impact in Syrian society 20, 30 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Our next speaker is Dr. Mark Katz. He is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. Dr. Katz writes on Russian foreign policy, the international relations of the Middle East, transnational revolutionary movements, and other subjects. He has been a research fellow at the Brookings Institution, held a temporary appointment as a Soviet Affairs Analyst at the U.S. Department of State, and was a Rockefeller Foundation International Relations Fellow and a Kennan Institute Research Scholar and Research Associate. He was also a United States Institute of Peace Jennings Randolph Fellow in 1989 to 1990, and a United States Institute of Peace grantee from 1994 to 1995. Recently, he was a visiting scholar at the Hokkaido University Slavic Research Center and at the Kennan Institute. His recent articles include Moscow's Middle East Policy and U.S. policy towards Syria, making the best of a bad situation. And he has written several books, including The Third World in Soviet Military Thought, Russia and Arabia, Soviet Foreign Policy Toward the Arabian Peninsula, Gorbachev's Military Policy in the Third World, Revolutions and Revolutionary Waves, Reflections on Revolutions, and Leaving Without Losing, the War on Terror after Iraq and Afghanistan. Dr. Katz, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Long. Great. I'd like to thank Sherman and the other organizers for this very kind invitation to be here at Tufts University. Really amazed at a huge crowd that is here on a Saturday. I'm not sure at my university we can generate something like this, but this is really, really wonderful. Anyway, if we had been holding this symposium just a week ago, I would have told you about how, of course, Russia opposes external intervention in the affairs of sovereign states, all circumstances. But it appears that events in Crimea have necessitated some revision to this formula, and that obviously intervention in some circumstances they believe is warranted. But when it comes to Syria in particular, as we all know, the Russians have been adamant that there be no external, no Western intervention in Syria. And this comes at the sort of the end for the Russians of a very long and frustrating process that they feel they have gone through with the U.S. In particular. Certainly, those of us who remember the Cold War know that there was precious little cooperation in the Security Council when it came to questions of authorizing intervention. But an awful lot of intervention occurred, didn't it? I mean, the U.S. and its allies intervened in many places. The Soviets and their allies intervened in many places. And this is simply the way it was. The Security Council essentially, you know, if it functioned as it was supposed to, it was highly exceptional. And that there were really only two major exceptions I can think of, and that is the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, and of course the Soviets happened to be boycotting the Security Council at that point and weren't able to vote. That didn't happen again. But most importantly, in 1990, with regard to Iraq's intervention in Kuwait, the Security Council authorized the use of force against it. Moscow didn't join in the intervention against Iraq, but it authorized it. And in many respects, this experience, in my view, established the gold standard of what expectations were about when intervention was to occur. In fact, it's really quite remarkable. I remember back in those days to think that President George H.W. Bush managed to obtain Security Council authorization for intervention before he even got U.S. congressional authorization. That was sort of the power of his diplomacy, and that this is how it was going to be. But of course, it wasn't this way at all. Now, the Security Council has authorized intervention in certain cases. I think of Timor-Leste, Côte d'Ivoire, and of course Afghanistan after 9/11. But there have been cases where intervention has occurred without Security Council authorization. The Russians were especially unhappy about Western intervention against Serbia in the 1990s. And of course, they were very unhappy, along with many others, about the US-led intervention in Iraq in 2003. And so they have been agitating for the Security Council to operate as it has been designed, where of course they have a veto. In other words, that intervention can only occur when Russia says it should occur. And so we come to the Arab Spring, and of course the event in 2011 with regard to Libya. Now this is at a time when Dmitry Medvedev was president, Putin's protege, if you will. Putin was prime minister, and the question arose, should there be intervention? I don't dispute our colleagues' characterization about what may have happened in Libya, but certainly the press reports at the time was that there was about to be a slaughter, and of course the necessity of intervening was considered to be great. And I think very importantly, the Arab League, and particularly the Saudis, were agitating for intervention. And so the Security Council did authorize a no-fly zone with regard to Libya. Now what happened, of course, was that far more than had been authorized actually took place. And Putin in particular has seized upon this, that the US and its allies overstepped the boundaries of the Security Council resolution. He wasn't going to let this happen again. And so with regard to Syria in particular, the Russians have refused to authorize even economic sanctions against the Syrian government for fear that this would be the thin edge of the wedge for Western intervention. Now, I think that, it's, and they have kept this point of view. Now, we have seen recently authorization for humanitarian supplies in the past week or so. But I think that what the Russians have seen a change, and since the crisis over the chemical weapons usage in Syria last August, when President Obama indicated that the U.S. was going to launch a military strike if he could get congressional, if he was going to get congressional approval. I think, as everyone knew, the Congress was not going to approve. And then when the Russians sort of responded to John Kerry's indication that there should be agreement on removing chemical weapons, and the Obama administration responded on this. Essentially, I think from the Russian point of view, they basically got what they wanted, because acceptance of this agreement to remove chemical weapons from Syria requires the cooperation of the Assad regime, and that the U.S. had basically acknowledged this. And so I think that they were fairly happy about that. And what I also think is that what Putin understands about the Obama administration is that it does not want to intervene in Syria. The Russians have a lot of experience observing the United States. They know full well that when the U.S. really wants to intervene, we don't bother to wait around for Security Council approval. If we get it, that's fine, but if we don't get it, we're going to intervene. Therefore, the U.S. Doesn't want to intervene, and if the U.S. wants to cite Russian opposition in the Security Council as a reason not to intervene, that's fine with Putin too. That makes him look a lot more important than he actually is. So he's happy to do that. But I just want to read this from a translation of an article that appeared in the Russian newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta this past September during the height of the chemical weapons crisis, about sort of how the Russians really view this question. And the author says, the U.S. today is threatening to attack Syria without authorization from the UN. But keep in mind that the military operations against Iraq and Serbia were also launched without UN mandates. the UN does not curb the strong or protect the weak. Very, very cynical, very Russian point of view about this question, it seems to me. And I think that, you know, for Putin in particular, it's not so much that he opposes intervention. Obviously, with what happened in Georgia, what happened in Crimea, indicates that it is acceptable. What he wants is a sort of an older version of the concert of powers, if you will. In other words, that the good and the great should be the ones that cooperate. That yes, you can have a UN or a Security Council to approve of what are decided upon by the major powers, but that it's the major powers that should make these decisions. And that what annoys him more than anything is that the U.S. doesn't want to see play this game. And why not? Is it because the U.S. does not regard Russia as a major power? And certainly the Obama administration's warnings to Russia about not intervening in Crimea, obviously they haven't been very effective. But the very fact that they would issue these warnings at all when the U.S. intervenes without Russia's approval is something that I think Putin finds especially galling. Now, you know, I think that just like in the years following the U.S. withdrawal from Indochina, that now that you know, the U.S. has withdrawn from Iraq, is withdrawing from Afghanistan, doesn't seem to be interested in Syria, and that I think we're going to go through another period in which the U.S. is not so willing to intervene. A period that will probably end just as the previous one did. And I think that for, you know, Putin is very, he's happy about this. On the other hand, I think that you know, he also, what he understands is that if the United States isn't going to get involved, it's not clear that Russia can do much on its own. In other words, that if Putin has a model for Syria, it's Algeria in the 1990s. That's a government that he really admires. Faced Islamist opposition, took him years to do it, but by God, they squashed these people. He also feels that he didn't do so badly in Chechnya, and the trouble is in Syria, they can't do that. In other words, that it's simply too big a conflict, that it cannot simply be suppressed, and that there are going to be consequences. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Katz. Our final panelist for this panel today is Duncan Pickard. He is a non-resident fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, and he focuses on North African politics. He is also a constitutional advisor for Democracy Reporting International. Mr. Pickard was the Libya Country Director for Democracy Reporting International. He previously worked in Tunis for the International Foundations for Electoral Systems. His writing on constitutional reform in Libya and Tunisia has been published by Foreign Policy, the Huffington Post, the Journal of Democracy, and the Journal of North African Studies, among others. Pickard holds degrees in international relations and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard University and Tufts University.
Thanks, Elissa. And thank you, Sherman, for the introduction as well. It's really great to be back at Tufts. It's my first time in a couple of years. So. I'm going to also, just like some of the other panelists, talk a bit about Libya today, but not from the perspective of military intervention, more about the role of the international community in propping up the legitimacy of transitional institutions in Libya in the early days of the revolution. So, and to illustrate this, I'm going to tell the story of the early days of the National Transitional Council, which was the political reform, transitional government, political reform commission in Libya. Just to get you back in the mindset, the Libyan revolution started in February of 2012. This was, 2011, thank you. Time flies, but not that fast. It started about a month after the departure of former President Ben Ali from Tunisia. He left on January 14th, And then every year on February 15th in Libya, there is a protest in Benghazi to demand justice for some political prisoners at a former prison called Abu Salim. This is an annual protest, and it always happens on February 15th. In this case, it was a bit different because it was a month after Ben Ali had left. And so the protest was much bigger this year than it was in previous years. And in particular, there was a journalist, a young journalist in Benghazi named Fatih Turbel, who had been arrested at this protest. And 2 days later, there was a further protest at the police headquarters a little bit outside of Benghazi to demand the release of Fatih Turbel. And this protest quickly escalated, got quite violent. There was actually, at one point, they were throwing tear gas over the walls and other homemade munitions over the walls. And then at the same time, maybe about a mile down the road in central Benghazi, there was a group of lawyers that had staged a more peaceful protest in front of the courthouse, the Court of Appeals in Benghazi. So as the protest in front of the police station got more violent, the protesters ran down the main street in Benghazi, about a mile down the way in front of the central courthouse to team up with this team of lawyers. And these two protests coming together just blew the lid off of the security situation in Benghazi. And the lawyers joined forces with these anti-police protesters, and they stormed the doors of the courthouse where there were a number of Gaddafi officials hanging out inside. Very hectic scene out front, several thousand protesters in the square. And essentially, the first people that had pushed themselves inside the courthouse were this group of 12 lawyers that had been staging a peaceful protest in their robes and everything. And the scene was so chaotic outside that they pushed their way inside the door and quickly locked the doors behind them, and after the Gaddafi officials had left. And so now they've locked themselves inside the courthouse. There are several thousand screaming protesters outside, and they have to find a way to organize what's going on, to organize themselves, to organize this revolution. And they set up what they call a local council for Benghazi. Similar kinds of local councils were actually formed in other places around eastern Libya at this time. And about a week later, on March 5th, a number of representatives from these local councils came together in Benghazi to talk about how to give shape to the revolution. And they nominated a gentleman to lead this council, and they also nominated a gentleman named Mahmoud Jibril, who was a prominent dissident living outside of the country. He was at the time in Dubai, but they nominated him to be the head of essentially the executive council of this National Transitional Council that they created, and he was going to take responsibility for international affairs. Almost immediately, he hasn't been to Benghazi at this point, he's still in Dubai. Almost immediately, he flies to Paris, where there's an international meeting of heads of state and foreign ministers. And when he goes to Paris, he sees Secretary Clinton, he sees Nicolas Sarkozy. At the same time, the NTC, he's not taking orders from the National Transitional Council that had been set up in Benghazi. They're sort of organizing themselves, trying to get militias together. They're operating almost separately. And despite this, Sarkozy is able to convince the French president that this National Transitional Council is representing all of Libya, and this is something that they should get behind. And so 5 days later, on March 10th, 5 days later, this is about 3 weeks after 2 or 3 weeks after the council itself was formed, the French president gets up and says that the National Transitional Council, no one really knows who their members are, but the National Transitional Council is the legitimate representatives of the Libyan people. Now, this had a really remarkable effect on consolidating the revolution within Libya. It built international support, certainly for the NTC. The US followed suit shortly thereafter. But more remarkably, international recognition helped consolidate the revolution within Libya. And we're not even talking at this point about the Security Council, about NATO, about military intervention. It's just about giving credibility to this transitional institution to give some shape to the revolution. Now, there are a lot of normative questions that come out of this story about the nature of legitimacy and who has the moral authority to rule in times of transition. This is a very deep question. I think most of us would agree that that kind of legitimacy does not exclusively come from the international community. And by no account can the NTC actually claim, hold up the claim to legitimacy that they put forward. They were not the rightful successors to authority on any account of pedigreed succession. They were not chosen by any procedure, either customary or invented, by the people that they claim to represent. They did not secure the basic rights or liberties of the people that they claim to represent. And they didn't even control the territory where the people that they claim to represent inhabited. So these normative questions are extremely interesting. Turning more to the positivist questions, though, the international community was essential, but almost certainly not normatively sufficient for the success of the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi, and almost by virtue alone of the credibility that the international community lent to the NTC. Again, even just talking about political credibility, not talking about the military intervention that came later. So, from one perspective, this is sort of a +1 for global governance. Now, I actually this morning woke up in Chisinau, Moldova. So I just came from 3 flights to get here. I haven't even hugged my mom yet, who came up from the Cape for today's presentation. But we can compare this situation about global governance to what Professor Katz was talking about Crimea, certainly. When I was in Moldova, I was meeting, I met yesterday actually, with the head of the parliamentary group, the pro-EU parliamentary group, who was himself a pro-EU official, was decrying global governance, the role of global governance in Moldova. He was talking about how this ceasefire that had been negotiated in Ukraine, backed by the EU and signed by foreign ministers of Britain, France, Germany, was not sufficient enough to keep the conflict from escalating, and Crimea is sort of on the brink of secession, if Professor Katz would agree with that. So in all of these cases, it's hard to sort of vote up or down on whether global governance is good or bad for political transitions. It's just an important factor, an important aspect to factor into these local and regional politics. And I just want to conclude with one joke that this Moldovan politician told me. He said that in Moldova there are no political parties, there are only geopolitical parties. Which I think summarizes the fun quite nicely. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you to all of our panelists. Before we open up the floor for questions, I would like to ask if any of the panelists would like to respond to one another. Then if not, we will now open up the floor to questions from the audience. Those wishing to ask questions may line up behind one of the 2 aisle microphones. I ask that you ask one question and limit your speaking time to 1 minute, and that you ask one question to one panelist. And we will start with this one.
Good afternoon. My name is Junius Williams. I'm a senior at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. And my question is directed to Professor Roberts. You mentioned that it would have been ideal for the Libyan and Iraqi people to remove their leaders by their own efforts or on their own volition. However, generally speaking, what happens under conditions in which the mechanisms to remove such leaders by the people does not exist? Is there room for international intervention at that point?
My view is that the intervention prevented, if we take the Libyan case, the intervention secured the defeat of Gaddafi, the overthrow of his regime, and the destruction of what there was in the way of a state in Libya. And there was something in the way of a state, certainly as far as the effect of Libya on the broader question of security in North Africa was concerned. over the last 3 years, we've seen a massive expansion of insecurity in North Africa in the absence of Gaddafi state. But on the question of what concerns, I believe, you, namely the problem of doing away with tyranny and so forth, my view is that the rebellion in Libya was prevented from acquiring the political coherence and organization and broader appeal across the country that it needed to acquire before actually assuming power. That, in other words, the NATO intervention precipitated events and then left Libya in chaos, which is where I believe it still is. There is, of course, more hopeful prognoses available, but you will believe what you wish to believe on that later. The point is that it had a preempting effect on the dynamics of the rebellion itself, which is why I was opposed to that intervention and argued for a non-violent intervention, given the grounds for concern and the sheer political fact that this concern was widely shared about the humanitarian aspect. I argued for an intervention to bring about a ceasefire and then to allow for negotiations between the two sides, which I believe would be protracted and which would actually be a stimulus to the rebellion gaining in political coherence and organization before being confronted with the need of actually constituting itself into a new state. That argument was swept aside, and the results are there for you to assess. I hope that provides an answer to your question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ol Schleif from the IDF delegation. I also have a question for Dr. Roberts. You've mentioned the panic that promotes intervention. My question is it possible that we're now witnessing a post-traumatic reaction which also paralyzing the public discussion and drives the US to avoid interfering even when it's required?
I'm not going to commit myself in an answer to that. What it seems to me you're suggesting is, has there been a shift in the pendulum in Western public opinion that leads to an undesirable state of inhibition where intervention is called for? Well, I would hope that the element of disenchantment or skepticism that seems to have grown at any rate in public opinion, with which I align myself, will lead to something that has been sadly lacking, in my view, over the last 24 years, that is to say, an informed debate about the pros and cons of all these policy matters, where the debate isn't preempted by hysteria or demonization. For instance, my position on Libya was immediately attacked very widely as being pro-Gaddafi when it wasn't pro-Gaddafi at all. So the point is that the quality of public debate has suffered very greatly over the years up until now, or up until last year. I'm hoping that while of course people may fear paralysis, and I dare say the British government in particular is particularly concerned at the implications of its own action in referring the matter of intervention to Parliament, something that was constitutionally without precedent, and I imagine they'll try to find an occasion for reversing that decision and restoring the Crown's prerogative in such matters. I nonetheless hope the rest of us will recognise the need for serious debate about these matters, that it's rational and informed, and doesn't involve demonizing people, or let alone demonizing the other point of view in such debates. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vladimir Polertov, Russian delegation. First and foremost, distinguished guests, thank you for your rousing speeches. My question is to Mr. Katz. I would like to ask your opinion of the post-Cold War syndrome that may exist among those policymakers and some experts in the US. Can you see it as a hindrance towards Russian-American cooperation in dealing with many aspects of burning issues on global agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, certainly among people my age and older, we were used to thinking about Moscow used to thinking about us, and so we continue to do so. But I think that there is one enormous difference. That is, back during the Cold War, every single conflict on this earth had a Soviet-American dimension, and that dimension was extremely important because of the possibility of a broader conflict. I think now the problem with Russian-American relations is that it's just one more relationship among a whole series of others, and it's actually not the most important relationship necessarily for either of us. And I think that that's what makes it difficult, especially for people who are used to thinking of it as so important before.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Zuba. I'm also with the Russian student delegation here. My question is for Professor Roberts. Professor Roberts, you mentioned in your speech that the UN policy is currently dominated by the 5 victors of the Second World War, and that they, and the US also is in their number, can use their position to legalize military interventions on behalf of the UN. This is exactly what Russia has been cited, the Russian government has been cited as trying to avoid when they didn't sign the resolution concerning Syria, and it has been since forth heavily criticized for impeding the democratic process. So what solutions would you see for between the leaders currently in the UN, especially the US and Russia, for separating national military interests from the UN's goals of promoting humanitarian rights and providing humanitarian aid?
I think that's actually a very interesting question, because I think there always has been, particularly given the grounds of thinking that the invocation of elevated principles has been rather spurious, and as I suggested, involved the debasement of those principles. I think it is actually very desirable that the question of international action that is collectively agreed should be, and should be seen to be, distinct from the pursuit of particular national interests. That would give such interventions far more credibility and moral authority and political authority as a result. I think they would also make them less precipitate, more considered, and the way to do this is actually to involve a larger range of points of view in the decision to resort to military intervention. I'm thinking particularly of military intervention. That is the explicit and violent violation of national sovereignty of particular countries. And what I would suggest, I mean, I haven't given this great thought. I'm not a specialist on the UN or the question of UN reform, which is occasionally invoked as a possibility, but nothing much ever happens. I think I am certainly of the view that reform of the UN is way overdue. And one thing that just occurs to me, at least as an idea to consider, is that resolutions or proposals to intervene militarily in a member state of the UN, proposals agreed by the Security Council, should then be subject to ratification by the General Assembly, possibly by a 2/3 majority. In other words, there should be some sort of break on the process to ensure that it is possible to talk about the international community without resorting to base hypocrisy in the process. So I would wish to democratize the decision-making process to make it more truly representative of world opinion. Then I think you'd have better considered decisions being made.
Thank you very much.
Aujourd'hui au Monaco. I'm doing a PhD here at Fletcher, and I just came back from Libya recently. Sorry to keep compounding on you, Hugh, but I have a question for you. You know how much I appreciate your ability to actually help us question the policies of our countries. But I would like to push you a little bit and ask you if you can help us play out the scenario in a case in which there had been no foreign intervention. On the 18th of March, one day prior, there was a ceasefire declared by the regime. At the same time, the Ahmed Khamis Brigade, the 32nd Brigade, the Praetorian Guard, commanded by the son of Gaddafi, was actually attacking Misrata. So I'm not sure that the regime had taken over the cities that were rebelling against it. And tanks were about 50 kilometers out of Benghazi, and a young Libyan had been just killed by a bullet between his eyes. He was the young man that was able to convey the images of what was going on throughout the world, Mohammed Nabous. 5 days after the uprising in Tripoli, there were people in the streets, and unlike in other countries, Gaddafi troops were shooting on people with anti-aircraft machine guns, which would cut the bodies in half. So I wonder if you can help us play out the scenario that would have happened in case there had been no foreign intervention. And I'm not a pro-interventionist. I took part to the campaign in Yugoslavia, and I'm still questioning whether it was a right decision. Last event that happened on the 19th actually was a missed opportunity, something that didn't happen. I'm not sure it would have worked, but an African Union delegation could not fly into Tripoli to discuss a peaceful avenue for the resolution of the conflict. And I wonder if the panel, anybody, would have delved a little deeper on the prospect for regional arrangements and regional mechanisms to solve these problems. Thank you.
I think that if this was a session, or even ideally a 3-day conference devoted to the ins and outs of Libyan history, it would be appropriate to get into a detailed debate about precisely what happened and the precise chronology events on particular days. What I would say is that clearly if there hadn't been any intervention, Gaddafi's regime would have crushed the rebellion. That's pretty obvious. That isn't the position I took at the time. I and the ICG argued for an intervention to secure a ceasefire. Now, the fact of the matter is, within hours of the passing of Resolution 1973, Gaddafi declared a ceasefire. It was perfectly reasonable for people to be skeptical, to want to ensure that that declaration corresponded to actions. Something along the lines was precisely what David Cameron then called for. However, in the meantime, the military spokesman for the Transitional National Council, had publicly rejected a ceasefire. There was no attempt to reciprocate the putative government ceasefire, and following David Cameron's demand for actions not words, or saying we will judge Gaddafi by his actions rather than his words, President Obama made a very, very remarkable statement, which was that for this to be acceptable, for the ceasefire to be acceptable, it was necessary for Gaddafi to withdraw his forces from about 4 or 5 of the towns that they had managed to recapture. There was nothing about that in the UN resolution. The first article of the UN resolution called for a ceasefire, and I argue, and I put it to you, that the facts bear out view that neither London nor Paris nor Washington actually wanted a ceasefire, and when the possibility of a ceasefire was at least mooted by Gaddafi, their reaction was to sabotage that possibility. And that they only had the ceasefire idea in the resolution because that was what an important element of world opinion had wanted, a ceasefire resolution rather than a let's go to war resolution. And the idea of including that in the resolution was to co-opt dissent to secure a totally spurious consensus behind the resolution, when in fact the plan was to go to war as Western action subsequently made clear. Sorry, if I just add, I mean, the idea of a regional approach was precisely what we supported. The International Crisis Group called for the involvement of regional players, both Arab and African, in the process of securing proper negotiations for a transition, and in the process of the deployment of peace forces to ensure the ceasefire was maintained. So I entirely support Jean-Louis' proposal that we should take on board the need to involve regional players. That was something that ICG already supported. But I would argue that it wasn't, in fact, taken seriously by the war party at the time. The military intervention was basically London, Paris, and Washington, with Italian complicity, and of course the active involvement of Qatar. And that was about it, with African opinion being ignored.
Midshipman Andrew Warnick from the United States Naval Academy. My question is for Mr. Pickard. You mentioned earlier that international recognition consolidated the Libyan transitional government. I was wondering if you thought that this was a strong enough policy, that it actually worked in helping the Libyan front push forward, and whether or not the U.S. should continue this type of policy intervention in the future.
Yeah. Good question. I'm glad that I get to say a few more words about that. It's it is what I said. It is. I should have been more precise in what I meant. However, what I meant was that that international recognition, particularly French recognition, and then other bilateral recognition that came later, helped bolster the credibility of the NTC among Libyans as the face of the political face of the revolution. The NTC never had complete control over the militias that were essentially conducting the war. That was always more of a military decision. That was a decision that was made by the heads of the brigades themselves and somewhat loosely by some of the military leadership within the NTC. I think, sort of waiting to jump out behind your question is about political recognition of the Syrian National Council, which no Western government did very early on, and members of the SNC were using the NTC as an example of saying that international recognition would help bolster the credibility of the SNC among Syrians. And then Western governments were coming back and saying, well, you need to demonstrate that you have more credibility before we actually do that. So it's a bit of a catch-22 in that case. And certainly I think that the NTC had less of a claim to recognition than the SNC had when they were asking for it. You ask a really great question, but it's a very tough one, and I don't think that, I just think it has to be contextual. We see the effects of international recognition in some of these cases, and it has to be a case-by-case basis, but it should definitely be considered as a policy option, as it has been in the past.
Thank you very much.
Midshipman Casey, also from the United States Naval Academy. My question is for Mr. Atwood. Sir, assuming that there will be more interventions in the future, do you believe that academia has a moral obligation to shift its focus from debating the legitimacy of military intervention to an analysis of the efficacy of military intervention in hopes for improvement?
Great, thanks. I'll say a word afterwards about the regional organisations, if it's okay. Yeah, I don't know enough about the academia. I think there is an academic debate about the efficacy, about the effectiveness of international interventions. I think it's quite a big debate. And it runs in various streams. Of course, it's dominated at the moment by debates about the interventions in particularly Afghanistan and Iraq. Perhaps now you lump in Libya with that. But then I think there's a concurrent debate which relates to African peacekeeping. It's a very different debate, and the themes are really, they're almost, sometimes there's a bit of overlap, and you hear a lot of the same words like security sector reform and state building, these things, but they're really completely separate debates in some ways. And I think this is largely because the sort of motives of Iraq and Afghanistan are very different from the motives for going into African states. So I'm not sure whether I think the debate about the legitimacy is an extremely important one. I think the debate of the effectiveness, I think is also an extremely important one, but I don't think it's not happening. I think it is happening. And again, I think there's a sort of broader point about this. Hugh hinted at it. I think it's tempting, certainly in the case of Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, to sort of pin the difficulties of building a stable policy, building a stable polity, building a stable political order in those places. I think it's tempting to pin the reasons for that on sort of bad motives for going in or mistakes made after the interventions. Clearly the motives were bad, I think, overall, and there were big mistakes made. In Iraq, the obvious one was demarcation. In Afghanistan, you have sort of excluding the Taliban, the violent warlords. In Libya, you probably have failing to pursue a ceasefire. So the motives were not good after the war on terror, and the mistakes, I think, were there. But I think that it would be a mistake to sort of look for all the answers in those bad motives and those mistakes. I think inherent to the task, which I think is becoming apparent, is the state-building enterprise. And again, it's not just Iraq and Afghanistan, which are very different ones, but the whole agenda of lifting states out of fragility, of development aid, of trying to build strong states, build strong authority, and check it at the same time, which is not the traditional state-building path. I think there's still huge questions about those that are unanswered. I think whether it's actually possible or the extent to which outside intervention, whatever it is, whether it's development or support to governments or whatever, I think it's an overestimated variable still in the discourse. That actually the shape of international intervention affects countries probably in less important ways than we currently think or that the debate currently captures. It's probably a slightly long-winded response because I think there's a whole bunch of questions in there that you need to take out a little bit. Let me just say something about the regional organisations which came up as well. I mean, I think there's, again, it's a broader debate. It's not just related to Libya. In fact, the problem with Libya, of course, is that you had two, and they took different positions. And in the end, as Hugh said, the West went with the one that was convenient to them at the time, which was the Arab League, and ignored the African Union. I think the idea of relying on regional organizations, and a lot of this is in the UN Charter, but it was really developed by Kofi Annan, which Khaldun Becky was at the forefront of this, African solutions for African problems. And I think the idea of using regional organizations, certainly in the UN, it's very convenient. They can commit troops, they have more interest in committing troops, they understand the countries. And the sort of African model of peacekeeping, which is essentially the neighboring countries going in and sort of protecting, trying to keep the forces apart, I think was a popular one for a while. I think the limits of that are very clear now. Certainly in the Central African Republic, the African Union doesn't seem to have the capacity to keep factions restored or to keep factions apart. I think in Somalia, the idea that Kenya and Ethiopia are the ones doing the fighting is extremely problematic. Clearly, neighboring states have the idea that they don't have their own strong interests that their troops are pursuing. I think is misleading. And in some ways, you can imagine in the Middle East trying to run a peacekeeping model based on neighboring states intervening to keep the ceasefire. In a sense, that's what's happening in Syria. It's just not called peacekeeping. So I think there's a pushback now to a reliance on regional organizations for interventions. Again, it's a debate that's playing out.
In the interest of time, can our last two audience members asking questions, just ask your questions one after the other, and then we'll answer.
Okay. My name is Tatiana Kuznetsova. I'm from Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. I was born in Ukraine and I lived there 25 years. And historically Russia and Ukraine have broad connection, and there are a lot of Russian people who live in Ukraine and Ukrainians who live in Russia. My parents, they are also from Russia. And I travel a lot my motherland, and it's not a top secret that people in Crimea, they want to be part of Russian Federation. They speak Russian, they respect Russian government, and it's not secret also that there are a lot of people, Russian people in Crimea, and there is also a Russian Navy. And I have a question to Mr. Katz. I want to ask you, why do you think Russia could not support citizens and Russian Navy in Crimea?
Hi, thank you. My name is Saad. I'm a graduate student at Yale University. I'm also the founder of a startup which links up universities in the US with those in the Middle East. We've done projects between Yale and Iraq and Egypt, hopefully expanding soon, focusing on dual country classrooms. My question is with UNSC 1973, which authorized intervention in Libya, and this is mainly for Mr. Pickard, although I think Mr. Atwood and Mr. First are going to say as well, UNSC, the UN resolution 1970 often gets kind of underplayed, the resolution that the ICC should investigate into the Gaddafi family, basically, and the intelligence agent. My question is if the military intervention didn't happen, would the ICC resolution still have had an effect? Because the military intervention happened, does it set a precedent that for ICC recommendations by the UN Security Council to be effective, there has to be a military component as well? And what do you see as the future of the relationship between international law in terms of the ICC and what that does for the underground situation in terms of in a conflict?
Thank you for your question. It's a very, very important one. I think that it's very true. I think the majority of the population in Crimea, which is Russian-speaking, would in fact feel more comfortable adhering to Russia than to Ukraine. I think though that there's obviously competing views of what constitutes fairness. Ideally, this question would be decided by a internationally sanctioned referendum, and I would imagine the vote would come out in favor of either secession or joining Russia. But what we're seeing now is that Moscow seems to be pushing the issue in terms of a little bit more forcefully. And also, I have to go back to the Putin administration in particular has been opposed to secession in general. But now we've seen them support it in 3 places, in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, now apparently Crimea. If these places can secede from Georgia and Ukraine, well then why can't Chechnya or Dagestan secede from Russia? In other words, that secession is a double-edged sword. It works for you, but it can work against you. And the point is that it may seem clear in the mind of Vladimir Putin that, secession to leave countries and to join Russia, that's understandable, but that secession from Russia, no, that's not. But the people on the ground aren't going to see the difference. If they can do it, why not us? That's how they're going to see it. And so does he really want to open this Pandora's box? Because I have a feeling that Russia is going to find that there are several places that may want to leave.
It's a great question. I really don't have anything illuminating to say about it. I don't know much about the topic, so I would look down the panel.
I regard the decision by the International Criminal Court to take up this case, and it was clearly referred to it, but the decision to take it seriously and to do so with great publicity as an early indication that a war was going to be organized. Because it was a step in demonizing Gaddafi and therefore ruling him as out beyond the pale of any politically negotiated resolution. Now, this happened in February, I think the date was February the 23rd or 24th, 2011, and that was within 2 or 3 days of a story going around the world that the Libyan Air Force was slaughtering unarmed demonstrators. A story that was put out by Al Jazeera and bought into by all the main Western media, a story for which there was absolutely no foundation. And I think that's a very important fact. It had the function in the Libyan story of the Kuwaiti babies in 1990 in generating the hysteria. And at the same time we had the Libyan, I think it was Deputy Ambassador in New York, holding a press conference on the night of February the 21st, announcing that Gaddafi was perpetrating genocide. This is at a time when Human Rights Watch has estimated that around 300 to 400 people have been killed, a deplorable number, of course, but far short of any scale that would justify the use of the word genocide. My point here is this, that I believe that what happened was the instrumentalization of the International Criminal Court for political purposes, and that's just one of many instances that I believe could be cited if we have time to support my thesis that we're seeing the idea of law being debased in every one of these episodes.
Light time begins.
To hide and then reappear for good purpose, I hope. Mr. Atwood, George, on behalf of our institute, our greetings to you from Ted Mayer, the son, one of the sons of Dr. John Mayer, former champ. Thank you. It's my wonderful opportunity to present the Dr. Jean Mayer Award to the Institute for Crisis, your international crisis group. I just got an email from Ted Mayer, the son of one of the sons of Dr. Jean Mayer, a former chancellor and president, to be read out to our audience here. It'd be nice if this worked. One second, folks. He was here last night. Another magnificent evening. Your students were remarkable. It would be hard for me to believe there's a better undergraduate course anywhere in the world. Very nice feeling. It's our initiative with you to have hosted so many of your wonderful ICT folks here. Rob and Sahar, I've just seen you come back, and Noah Bansi and many others, Ali, who was with us here previously. It is a delight to have worked with you, and we're going to continue to do that. This reads as follows. It's in 2 parts. I think everyone understands that at this point. In recognition of the unique hybridity of grounded analysis and policy advocacy in the pursuit of international peace. And that's what we certainly believe of you, and we're looking forward, to an ongoing relationship. Our undergraduates are primed for you, and we're hoping to continue to do the kind of research that you guys pursue to help you in that facet. So the International Crisis Group, first of all. You'll see something about John in your program. There are a couple of things I have to make note of. In your program, you will also notice a mistake. It says that dinner goes until 8:30. It does not. It goes until 8 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock this evening, we will convene here for the unraveling of Syria. I will be in a workshop with Dr. Katz anticipating next year, and so the question that was just asked here is going to be something that resonates with presage what happens to us next year when we look at Russia. But I think you know that there are these wonderful opportunities for 2 hours to interact with each other in more informal portions of things. The workshop on entrepreneurship has been canceled. What we're doing instead is having a larger forum with Gideon and Mr. Simon and Rob Lesher from ICG and Mouin, etc. on Israel-Palestine. It's been moved to 0002, that is to say 002 to Olin. It'll accommodate about 30 people. The other workshops will be far smaller. And so I would like to see you back here at 8 o'clock, but I'm going to hand this over now to Elissa, who's going to give us more detail on the breakout sessions and how you sign up, and we hope you spend some very quality time with us in these more informal sessions.
So, as Sherman mentioned, we will now have an array of breakout sessions that you can attend. The breakout sessions offer us the opportunity to cover some issues that we haven't been able to cover during the symposium, but we nevertheless acknowledge are very important, and they have been some of the most enjoyable parts of symposiums in the past. If you haven't yet signed up, there are sheets right outside the auditorium that you can sign up, and your program should have the room numbers. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me or any of the other Colloquium members or staff. And please help me in thanking all of our wonderful panelists.